Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the world of Christian mutual aid. We'll be exploring its long history, but also how it looks right now in the present day.
Exactly. We'll try to unpack how it works, where it came from, and its impact both on believers and, well, society more broadly. We've got some fascinating sources to draw on.
Yeah, and whether you're just curious about community building, or maybe the history of social support, or even just how faith and action intersect.
This deep dive should offer some maybe surprising insights. It's really a framework for understanding how people come together to help each other out.
Right, and just so you know what we looked at, we've gone through academic papers, detailed reports, all looking at the different forms, the history, the social side, and the challenges facing Christian mutual aid today.
With examples from, well, all over the globe, really,
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive.
is to pull out the really key stuff about Christian mutual aid, its core practices, how it developed historically, its influence, and the innovative ways it's adapting now.
Without hopefully overwhelming you with too much information.
Yeah, let's try and unpack it.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Traditional Christian mutual aid. Our sources often describe this as like the foundational type of support, the stuff that happens right within church structures.
That's right. It's sort of the built-in support system.
Yeah,
And it happens through some really established practices.
like the Sunday service.
Yes, like Sunday service provides that spiritual support, sure, but also a really vital sense of community connection for people.
Mm-hmm. That regular gathering point.
And then you have small group Bible studies. These allow for, deeper interaction.
Or personal.
Yeah, smaller settings, more learning, and that crucial mutual care happening on a closer level.
And you mentioned visitation ministry too.
Yes, active outreach,
Yeah.
church members or leaders visiting people who are struggling, maybe sick, elderly, facing tough times.
Offering practical help.
Practical help, an ear to listen, emotional support. It's quite hands-on.
And we saw that example from Rwanda, right?
Mm.
Churches regularly visiting older people, bringing supplies, but also just companionship.
Yeah, that really brings it to life, doesn't it? It shows the principle in action.
It does. So where did these ideas start? How far back does this go?
Well, if we look back at the early church, these principles were deeply embedded right from the start. Think about the early Christian support networks in the Roman Empire.
Okay, support networks, not quite communes then.
No, not like we think of communes today. But these early communities absolutely provided concrete help. Medical care, help with burials, which was a big deal, and even financial aid.
Wow. So real practical stuff.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting, according to the sources, is how this practical support was actually a key reason the early church grew, especially among, the lower classes. It attracted people.
That makes sense. A community that actually looks after you would be incredibly appealing in that world.
Precisely. It offered real security. It wasn't just about doctrine. It was meeting everyday needs. And that played a huge role in its expansion.
Okay, so it starts there. How did it develop through, say, the medieval period?
Well, the sources point to monasteries becoming key players. They developed pretty systematic ways of helping the poor.
Like the Rule of Benedict.
Exactly. That required monks to provide daily assistance to the poor. It became quite institutionalized within the monastic system.
Right, and then things change again, drastically, with the Industrial Revolution.
Huge changes. And you see Christian mutual aid adapting again. The focus starts shifting more towards things like labor rights, social justice issues.
Because the nature of hardship was changing with industrialization.
Right, new problems, new responses. The sources highlight Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, a really important document.
What did it argue for?
It directly tackled how workers were being treated. It pushed for better working conditions, for social welfare legislation. It kind of laid some groundwork for laws and safety nets we see later.
So moving beyond just charity to addressing the system itself.
Exactly, a broader focus. And that brings us closer to today. How are these old principles being applied now, especially with technology?
Yeah, how does it look in the modern era?
Well, what's really striking is this blend of the old and new. You still absolutely see traditional practices, visitation, small groups, they're still vital.
But adapted.
Adapted, yeah. And technology is a massive factor now. Online communities, virtual fellowships.
You mean like video platforms?
Yeah, the sources mentioned Gospel Home Online Church, over 1 million users on the Dudio platform, which is huge in China for social stuff. Even metaverse church gatherings.
Wow. So location isn't a barrier anymore?
Not in the same way. And it's not just gatherings. We're seeing data being used more strategically. World Vision uses these spiritual growth journey files to connect members with resources if they move.
Ah, okay. Like a continuity of care.
Sort of, yeah. And there's this platform in China, Shengtuan Life, serving over 7 million users, trying to match needs with help much more precisely, using data for efficiency.
Interesting. So it seems Christian mutual aid is pretty dynamic, constantly evolving.
Definitely adapting while holding on to core values.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into the specific forms and practices today. We've touched on some, but let's clarify how they work now.
Right. So the sources really stress that structural support within churches and fellowships is still fundamental. The Sunday service, small groups, visitation bird, those are still the bedrock.
But you mentioned fellowships offer more flexibility.
Yeah, exactly, because they often bring together specific groups, students, people in the same job they can tailor support.
Like the prayer passports.
Right. That was a student fellowship example. During exams, they write down prayer needs and support each other that way. Very specific, very timely.
Practical.
Very. And workplace fellowships using those spiritual growth journey files
Yeah.
to help new folks integrate, both socially and spiritually.
And it's not just peer groups, right? There was that intergenerational example.
Oh yeah, the Silver Youth Co-Learning Program in Taiwan, actively getting older and younger members learning from and helping each other. A really neat model.
It sounds, okay, so that's the internal stuff, but clearly Christian mutual aid goes way beyond the church walls.
Oh, absolutely. Social service, public action, that's a huge part of it. International relief and development is a major area.
And World Vision comes up a lot there.
It does.
Yeah.
Huge organization, active since 1950, over 100 countries. In 2024 alone, the sources say they reached 35 million people.
35 million, wow.
Yeah, including 19 million children. Food aid, education, clean water, massive scale, all rooted in Christian service principles.
And that's not new, this global reach.
No, there's historical precedent. The Moravian Brethren establishing medical stations, schools in Africa centuries ago. It's a long tradition.
Okay, so global aid is one thing. What about closer to home, in local communities?
Loads happening there. Liberation theology in Latin America is a key example the sources discuss.
How?
Churches becoming really key drivers for social justice, pushing for land reform, better education access. Farmer cooperatives in Brazil, organized by churches, for instance.
So churches as agents of social change.
Very much so. And you see collaboration, too, like the Canadian Chinese Christian Council working with other faith groups on food aid enrichment.
That cross-faith element is interesting.
It is, working for the common good. And you just have to think about all the church-run hospitals, schools, nursing homes globally. They're a massive part of grassroots services.
Often in places others don't reach.
Often, yeah.
Yeah.
Serving people regardless of race or religion. And there's that example from rural China. Again, fellowships providing medical and emotional support to the elderly left behind, filling crucial gaps.
It shows real community presence, and they step up in emergencies, too.
Definitely. Crisis response is vital. World Vision, again, helping 35 million in 84 global disasters last year.
Incredible numbers.
And locally, things like blood donation drives by the China Guanxi Christian Council. Direct life-saving action.
Okay, so the breadth is huge. Let's revisit technology quickly. How exactly is it reshaping things?
Well, as we said, online communities, virtual fellowships like Gospel Home, Metaverse churches, they just expand the reach massively, overcoming geography.
Creating digital versions of community.
Pretty much. Connecting people with shared faith and needs anywhere. And then the data side World Vision system, Shengtuan Life, it's about optimizing how help gets delivered, making it more efficient, more targeted.
Using tech to amplify the impact.
Exactly. Not just connection, but efficiency too.
All right, so you've seen the forms, the practices. What about the wider impact? Socially and on, well, people.
Yeah, this is where you see the ripple effects. Socially, churches often act as stabilizers in communities. That rural China example, again, providing belonging, support, strengthening the social fabric.
Community anchors.
Right. And in crises, they become resilience networks. World Vision's disaster work, the blood drives immediate help. Plus, their involvement often models good government NGO collaboration, like World Vision in China.
So it strengthens the community structure overall. What about individual? How does it shape values or behavior?
Well, the sources talk about how internalizing that love your neighbor ethic often spurs people to get more involved socially, taking responsibility.
Like that volunteer alliance in Taiwan.
Exactly. Free medical, legal help. Belief translating directly into action.
Faith as a motivator.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And there's this idea of action-oriented faith, passing down values. Liberation theology fostering social justice awareness across generations is a prime example.
So belief leads to action, which shapes the culture.
It's a cycle. And underpinning a lot of it is that theological idea of imago Dei, humans made in God's image.
Hmm.
Historically, that's been a huge driver for universal human rights. Think abolition of slavery, refugee rights advocacy.
Wow, a core belief influencing huge societal shifts. Okay, now, what about the impact outside Christianity on the non-Christian world?
This is really interesting. There's a diffusion of the culture, you could say. That love your neighbor idea has definitely influenced secular charity.
Yep.
Sources mention things like the United Way borrowing from church fundraising models,
Hmm.
or Tu Chi, the Buddhist group, having volunteer training that looks a bit like church small groups.
So methods and ethos spread.
They can, yeah. And even more directly, all that cross-faith cooperation we talked about.
Right, the examples from Canada, China, Sierra Leone.
Exactly. Richmond Christian Faith Month, the Guangxi Environmental Project with Buddhists, the church, and mosque working on health in Sierra Leone.
It shows collaboration is possible, even central sometimes.
Absolutely. Often based on shared values like human dignity. You see it in interfaith disaster relief, too. And beyond direct work, the ethical standards can influence other fields. Social enterprises drawing on Christian principles, liberation theology impacting social policy in Latin America.
So it's not just direct aid, it's a wider influence on how we think about helping and organizing. Okay, given all this impact, what are some of the roadblocks or challenges today?
Well, there are definitely challenges. Globalization and secularization are big ones. In very secular places like Sweden, with the Lutheran Church example, participation can decline. So innovation becomes crucial.
Staying relevant.
Exactly. Then there's cultural conflict and identity issues. Concerns about the, quote, commoditization of faith, like with the Yoido Full Gospel Church in South Korea mentioned in the sources.
And working across cultures must be complex too.
Very. Balancing local traditions with Christian values requires real sensitivity. And there can be controversies, like maybe overemphasizing spiritual healing versus medical needs in some contexts, like parts of Africa.
Requires careful navigation. Okay, let's just zoom in again on that cross-faith cooperation piece. It seems really significant.
It really does. Those examples, Richmond, Guangxi, Sierra Leone, they clearly show Christian groups willing and able to work with other faiths.
And why is that so important?
It just highlights how expansive mutual aid can be as a principle. It's about serving the wider community, the public good, working beyond your own boundaries.
Based on shared values.
Yeah, recognizing that helping people transcends religious lines, it really begs the question,
Which is?
how do we encourage more of that? These examples show it's possible and powerful for tackling big societal issues together.
Absolutely. It really drives home that shared values and common goals can build bridges. Okay, well, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try and summarize the key takeaways.
Sure, so I think it's clear Christian mutual aid is, well, deeply rooted, but also incredibly diverse. It spans everything from traditional church support
Like Sunday service and
Yeah.
small groups.
right up to these big tech-driven platforms and major global social action initiatives.
And it's definitely not static. It's evolved hugely over time, adapting to new contexts, using new tools.
And leaving a really significant mark on societies, on individuals, both inside and outside the Christian community itself, influencing charity, shaping values, fostering that crucial cross-faith work.
It's been a fascinating look at faith in action, really. So, for our final thought for you, the listener, given everything we've explored today, the history, the diversity, the impact of Christian mutual aid, what might be the best ways for communities, whether they're religious or secular, to build truly resilient, truly compassionate support systems in our world today?
Yeah, what are the core principles here? You know, the underlying ideas from these models that can maybe be applied more universally to build stronger social bonds, better well-being right where you are.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.